As you all know, we're facing into a referendum campaign and are awaiting the publication, as Professor Whyte said, of the proposed text for the amendment to the Constitution, as well as the legislation that the government will put forward should the referendum be carried. The Taoiseach himself has accepted in his speech announcing the referendum that there are no guarantees with this legislation, and bad as it is likely to be, it can be changed for the worse by any future Oireachtas. So I want to consider first how the debate is being framed by the government and in the media, and how this framing is wrong and dishonest. And I want to consider in particular the speeches recently given by the Taoiseach and Ministers Harris and Zappone. And then secondly, Professor Whyte described very well the potential legal consequences of repeal. I want to look at the cultural consequences for our society and what we are not being told by the media. And then thirdly, I'd like to examine the potential ramifications for the medical profession and the idea of conscientious objection and why it's not being mentioned. So to begin with the framing of the debate, the opening exchanges of the debate on the Eighth Amendment have been interesting for what they reveal about the way in which the government wants to frame this issue, and also the tactics that we can expect to see from those in favour of repeal over the next few months. Those in favour of repeal want to take away a right to life in order to make way for a right to kill. But the framing involves avoiding this truth at all costs and couching all discussion in language like choice, healthcare, women's rights. All of this is done to muddy the waters. There's no simple language used, no honest dialogue. The most important thing in this debate, for those who wish to remove the rights in our Constitution guaranteed to children before they're born, is to engage in an exercise to hide the truth and avoid having to justify the worst kind of injustice done to children before they're born. If you think I'm exaggerating, let me give you some examples. Just last week, the Taoiseach, flanked by two of his ministers, gave a carefully rehearsed speech in which he asserted that he wanted the people to authorise his government to introduce legislation which would provide for abortion. He said, if the amendment is approved in a referendum, abortion in Ireland will become safe, legal, and rare. Rare. Why should abortion be rare? There is an obvious answer, but it's one that the Taoiseach not merely failed to give, he studiously avoided even touching on it. At no point in his speech did the Taoiseach mention the word baby. What is obvious to anyone who isn't a partisan in this debate, and what's clearly established by science, is that when there's a pregnancy, there's another human being involved. This is a fact that did not feature at all in the Taoiseach's speech because it is highly inconvenient to the agenda that he and his government are pursuing. They seek to present abortion as an issue that affects only pregnant women. Now, obviously, pregnant women are affected, but on no fair or balanced view can this be regarded as the whole truth. Abortion at any stage involves the deliberate destruction of a human being. That human being is not the mother. It is a unique and irreplaceable individual who has never existed before and never will exist again. It robs that individual of his or her only life. This, although unspoken, is the reason why anybody who has an ounce of human feeling must regard abortion with horror. Minister Catherine Zappone, when asked how she, as Minister for Children, could preside over the introduction of a law that would allow for the destruction of children before their birth, answered as follows: I believe that the fetus holds the potential for human life that develops over time, and I think my views in relation to abortion and the legislation are consistent with that view. Well, on this we can agree. Her position on the legislation is consistent with this view that there is no human life involved other than that of the mother. But this is so obviously wrong that Minister Zappone's denial of the humanity of the baby renders her a scientific flat earther. However, Minister Zappone's call for rare abortion makes absolutely no sense if she doesn't believe another human being is involved. If no other life is affected, if this were, as the Taoiseach presented it, a personal and private matter for women, then there could be no sensible justification for insisting that abortion should be rare. Indeed, if abortion is just healthcare, as we've been repeatedly told by Simon Harris, then it shouldn't be restricted in any way. Nobody tells us that corrective eye surgery should be safe, legal, and rare. If you've got a problem with your eyes or you want to get them fixed, go ahead, they're your eyes after all. The insistence against the weight of international evidence, history, and common sense that abortion, once introduced, will be rare is part of a sinister attempt by abortion activists, and now sadly the government, to seek to assuage the discomfort of the electorate. Even with massive relaxation of our laws on abortion, don't worry, abortion will not become commonplace. Ireland, we must assume, is different to everywhere else in the world where abortion has been brought in. There is no intellectual honesty in this position. The Taoiseach, his government, and repealers cannot have it both ways. They cannot, on the one hand, say they want to modernise our laws and bring us up to speed with the rest of abortion law throughout European countries, and then at the same time say that the result in those other countries of high rates of abortion will not be repeated here. The next assertion by the Taoiseach was that abortion is a deeply personal and private matter. Indeed it is, but only if you're not the person being killed. Why does the state have laws against attacks on other people? Is any attack on another human being a purely private and personal matter? Obviously not. That's why we have laws against them. It just happens to be convenient to the government to present this proposal as though it doesn't involve an attack on anyone else. The Taoiseach went on to say that this issue isn't black and white. It involves, he said, the balance between the rights of a pregnant woman and the fetus or unborn. This, the only mention of the baby in his speech, is in cold, clinical, medical terms, in complete contrast to how he describes women seeking abortions. For them, he uses emotive language and conjures up images of women making the saddest and loneliest journey to England. This is done to dehumanise the baby and to desensitise us to the reality of what happens to him or her in an abortion. As for the balance he mentions, this is precisely what Article 43.3 or the 8th Amendment seeks to achieve. The 8th Amendment acknowledges the humanity of both mother and her baby and upholds the value and dignity of each. The mother's rights are totally protected by law, as are the child's. This is what normal people call balance. What the Taoiseach calls balance is a state of affairs in which the mere choice of the mother is sufficient to outweigh all other rights of the baby, including the right not to be summarily killed. This is a strange form of balance indeed. Mr. Varadkar stated I became convinced that abortion had no place in our constitution. Now, I think this is a worrying statement from the leader of our country, who doesn't seem to be aware that there's actually no mention of abortion in the constitution. Either that, or he's deliberately trying to conceal the fact in order to fool people by telling them they're voting for something other than the abolition of certain human rights. Contrary to what the Taoiseach suggests, we don't have a constitutional ban on abortion. This is critical for voters to realise. We're not being asked to vote away a ban on abortion. Rather, we're being asked to vote the human rights of the baby out of the Constitution. Obviously, it follows if the baby has certain human rights, the right to life, it follows that that child has the right not to be killed. And it's legislation that deals with abortion. But we're talking about removing the rights of the child from the Constitution. In fact, so intent is this government on making sure that every last shred of protection is taken from the child in the womb, that the Taoiseach was delayed in announcing the referendum while he considered, together with the Attorney General, whether the proposal should be for repeal simpliciter or repeal with an amendment that would give the ultimate power to the Oireachtas as opposed to the people on this issue. I thought there was something profoundly disturbing about how, in consultation with his lawyers, the Taoiseach looked for the best way to ensure that a proposal would be brought before the people, which would ensure every shred, as I said, of constitutional protection for the baby would be stripped away. I've carried 4 children and felt them kick and move and even hiccup in utero. I have witnessed how totally dependent and fragile and vulnerable and completely trusting they are at birth. For me, hearing about these men sitting down together to search for and close off loopholes, lest any vestige of protection remain for these helpless infants, was chilling. But the Taoiseach, in a tone which has been adopted by many of the pro-repeal campaigners, said that the time has come to allow people to make this decision. This echoes Peter Boylan's statement that people have moved on and that we just need to kind of act like an adult state and get on with it. As the Taoiseach said, his own views have evolved over time. The thing about evolution is that it only ever goes one way. So it is with those who evolve towards abortion. It's only ever more abortion, easier abortion, free abortion. Mr. Harris too reminded us that he has changed his view on the issue. The basis for this, he informed us, was that he had listened. Well, just what is it that Minister Harris has been listening to? We know that he has met on several occasions with various groups agitating for repeal of the 8th Amendment. We also know that he has, despite repeated requests, refused to meet different groups, such as those of parents with children diagnosed with what are erroneously called fatal fetal abnormalities, who elected not to give in to the pressure to do away with their very sick children. If one's determined to listen to just one side of the story, it's hardly surprising that one's views may move in a particular direction. There seems to be an obsession at the moment with what politicians call reality, though in truth it seems to be a limited reality to which they refer. By this I mean the reference to the illegal importation of the abortion pill, and how this has actually convinced many politicians that because people are doing it anyway, we should legalise abortion. Harris has talked a lot about realities, but like the Oireachtas Committee, chose to ignore the most significant reality at the heart of the issue, the fact that in every pregnancy, at least 2 lives are involved, and that in every abortion, an innocent child is killed. For Harris, the reality is that abortion happens. It follows, so he says, that we should facilitate abortions. This is a logical non sequitur of the first order. We have laws against speeding, yet people continue to speed. does it mean we should make it lawful? We've laws against the importation of serious drugs, including heroin, but people still continue to import heroin. Should we make it lawful? In either case, you might argue it for the case for reform, but the fact that the law is being broken from time to time doesn't mean that it's a bad law. If anything, it establishes that it may be necessary. If the law was never being broken, it might be redundant. So the reality proposition on which the repeal side places a great deal of reliance is ludicrous in my view. Yet Harris seems to think it's right simply because it relates to abortion. He warned us that the women travelling to Britain every year for an abortion were not faceless women. However, he seemed determined to make sure that the 170,000 Irish babies who have lost their lives since the 1980s are not only faceless, but are voiceless and powerless too. His, I think, is a Victorian approach. These children should be neither seen nor heard nor remembered. He mentioned Ireland's dark past, but he ignores the voices of people like a man identified as Patrick, who gave an interview to the Irish Catholic newspaper, who was a Tuam survivor. Patrick said, "They now want to offer abortion as a solution to unwanted children." Sure, isn't that me? He said. If abortion was legal back in the day, I probably wouldn't be here. The people that were born in Tuam, sure, we'd be the first ones aborted. Harris listed the number of women from every country in Ireland who had availed of abortion in Britain in 2016. But with every statistic he read, I saw the other side to those numbers. At least 3,265 Irish babies who lost their lives that year alone. And of course, we have to assume that some of those pregnancies involved twins. Those babies could have been adopted and given a second chance at life and brought joy to the many infertile couples in this country who would do anything to be able to adopt a child. He said, "I can't help but wonder what we would have done if we didn't have a neighbouring island to help us turn a blind eye. And sometimes turning a blind eye is the same as turning your back." And yet that's exactly what he's proposing to do to innocent children. Turn a blind eye, turn his back on these children who will be aborted because they don't have long to live, or because they have Down syndrome, or because their father is a criminal, or because their mother is poor, or simply because they're not wanted. A pro-choice mentality is exactly the one which turns its back on women contemplating abortion. It says, "Go, have your abortion. We'll fight for your right to it. Heck, we'll even pay for it. But after that, you're expected to be a good girl and not complain. You'll only let down the other women who have fought for this right." He referenced darker times in our history and then seemed to suggest that this contribution somehow heralded our ascent to the sunny uplands in a light-filled era where elected representatives approach this complex issue with clarity, compassion, and care. Surely, even somebody coming from a pro-choice perspective hardly sees abortion as something that is good or beautiful. The grim realities of the abortion clinic, the surgeon's implements, and the pain, discomfort, trauma, and heavy bleeding that accompany a medical abortion are anything but beautiful. The end result of a tiny human body being discarded in a bin or down a toilet is a reality which Minister Harris seems to want to ignore, despite proposing that this should be every woman's right. The minister doesn't even propose a proper burial for these babies. Another noteworthy aspect of the frame is this call for respectful and open debate. And that call is really a warning shot across the bow of the pro-life or the retain vessel. It's code for not making those in favour of repeal feel bad about what they're asking us to do. And needless to say, the requirement for respect doesn't actually extend to those on the pro-abortion side, who are free to lump all their opponents in with any historic wrong that they believe they can pin on the Catholic Church, just as Minister Harris sought to do in his response to the report of the Oireachtas Committee on the Eighth Amendment. He showed no respect to those who are against abortion and not Catholic, nor did he show any respect to the hundreds of thousands of decent, honest Catholics who have had no part in any abuse of women or anybody else, but simply recognise that it's never right to deliberately take another person's life. As for open debate, if Minister Harris, in introducing a parliamentary debate on a proposal to remove a constitutional provision which makes no mention of abortion but merely confirms that unborn children have a right to live, if he's determined to refer neither to children nor to life, how can we possibly take seriously his avowed wish for an open debate? I want to look briefly at the idea of the cultural consequences that I think that we can expect if the Eighth Amendment is to be repealed. I fear that these will be adverse, and I think they will also be very difficult to change once they have taken hold. As I've said already, it's folly to talk about importing an abortion regime that has already been in force in many European countries for years without looking at the consequences in those same countries. Madness is defined as doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result each time, and yet that's what our government seems to be proposing that we do. The fact is, no country with legalised abortion has rates as low as Ireland and Malta, where abortion is illegal. This is a logical and predictable result. If you legalise an action, you change people's attitudes towards it and you make it socially acceptable by making it legally acceptable. So in the case of abortion, it's logical that its legalisation would result in increased numbers of people availing of the service. If it is rare abortion that the Taoiseach is after, why legalise it, as he said, to relax it? How is the easy availability of abortion in this country going to reduce the 3.5 abortions that happen every year? Indeed, even if the number of Irish women seeking abortions were to stay static, which it will not, in my view, it seems the government hasn't bet on women travelling from other jurisdictions to Ireland for abortions. So the initial plans, as Professor Whyte mentioned earlier, to introduce abortion on mental health grounds, and as he said, there is no text, and even the legislation on its passageway through the Dáil could be changed. But if we assume that the legislation is, as they say, on mental health grounds, at the moment there is no proposal to introduce any time limits. It will mean that abortions laws could be more extreme than those of Britain's, where there is a 24-week cut-off. British women can't get an abortion under the mental health ground after 24 weeks. And if we have a more permissive regime here, which it looks like that's what the government is pushing for, women will come from Britain and other countries in much the same way that Irish women currently travel to Britain for later term abortions that they can't get in their own countries. And if you think this is far-fetched, there was an expose a few years ago about British abortion clinics referring their clients to clinics in Spain for late-term abortions that were illegal in Britain. Now, I mentioned the government's initial plans because, as the Taoiseach clearly admitted in the questions and answers session after his speech, he can't give any certainty in relation to the law. He stated, so it's important to say that the referendum will not be on draft legislation. The referendum will be on the amendment to the Constitution. This is an accurate statement. His proposal, in his words, can't tie the hands of a future Oireachtas. In other words, once the law protecting children before they're born is gone from the Constitution, the people of Ireland will be able to do nothing about any future Oireachtas changing the laws, other than voting the TDs out after the event. So we will have increased numbers of women seeking abortions in our hospitals. And if the Eighth Amendment is repealed, there'll be nothing to stop a future Oireachtas from making abortion more easily available and probably free, which is to say, paid for by the taxpayer. The statements from TDs and senators to date are also interesting culturally for the kind of precedent they set for lawmakers in this country in a wider context. The Taoiseach made the following statement in a speech: "I don't believe that the Constitution is the place for making absolute statements about medical, moral and legal issues." I think this is an astonishing pronouncement. The Constitution is the document in which fundamental rights are expressed. Where else would anyone expect to find absolute statements about legal and moral issues? As for the issue of disability, it has been incredible the way in which politicians have fudged this issue and really have been dishonest about the reality of the situation, aided and abetted by the Institute of Obstetricians. The Oireachtas Committee, chaired by Senator Catherine Noone, clearly received advice that Irish people feel uncomfortable about the idea of eugenic abortion of children with disabilities. For that reason, in their recommendations, they went against the Citizens' Assembly's recommendation and made only one exception to the general rule that abortion should be freely available. They said that it shouldn't be available on the grounds of disability. But they betrayed their real attitude towards people with disabilities in the report when they described these children as a burden. Here's the exact text. The committee, while noting the burden placed on the woman and the family in such situations, does not accept that these are sufficient grounds for termination. Rather, they said the state should provide resources so that there are better supports and facilities for people whose children have special needs. But, you might say, why aren't supports and facilities also offered to those who seek an abortion for other reasons, such as socioeconomic reasons? Why the exception for disability? Where's their rhetoric of choice now? What if the mother wants to choose an abortion? The fact of the matter is, the Oireachtas Committee, which, it has to be said, from the outset was overwhelmingly in favour of legalised abortion, knows well that by removing all protections from the Constitution for children before they're born, there will be complete freedom to abort disabled babies. In the face of concerns raised on the retain side, the Institute of Obstetricians, headed by Peter Boylan, weighed in to say that it was almost impossible to get a prenatal diagnosis of Down syndrome before 12 weeks, the proposed cut-off point in the government's proposal for abortion on demand. A cursory internet search and any conversation with expectant parents shows this is demonstrably false. At the moment in Ireland, prenatal screening is available from 9 weeks gestation, with results back in about a week. As for the idea that women only present to their doctors for the first time at 12 weeks, this too is inaccurate in most cases. I recall on my last pregnancy visiting my GP when I was 20 days pregnant, just 4 years ago. She suggested screening tests to me with a view to determining whether there was an abnormality, even though the thought hadn't entered my mind. This is clearly something that happens routinely, particularly with increasing maternal age. I also have personal experience of that atmosphere of testing later in pregnancy. So at my 20-week scan with my daughter, which as I understood it was really more to do with concerns for me because I had scarring due to previous operations, my husband and I were told that there were indications on the scan that our baby had markers that were consistent with a chromosomal abnormality. Specifically, Edwards syndrome, which is one of those described as fatal, or Down syndrome. We were immediately offered amniocentesis to confirm the indication, which we refused due to the risk of miscarriage. But the implication was clearly there in the air. Even though they knew where I came from, the implication was, whatever you choose, we'll facilitate you. This was at the point where our baby was 5 months gestation. That's a big baby. That atmosphere, that pressure is already present in our hospitals. And I should say, actually, our baby was born with absolutely no chromosomal difficulties or abnormalities. She ended up very sick otherwise, but came back to full health. So often those scans and indications are not accurate. But of course, with time, they will become increasingly accurate. And so parents will choose, as many do in other countries, like we've seen in Britain, over 90%, Iceland 100%. Throughout Europe, generally, it's over 80%, that people choose not to go ahead, as they would call it, with the pregnancy. So that atmosphere and pressure is already present in our hospitals. And this will only get worse if abortion is legalized here. The fact is that where abortion is legally available, those babies who are most vulnerable because of disability are the ones most at risk. Any disability, such as cystic fibrosis, spina bifida, or Down syndrome, that can be detected prenatally means that children who are diagnosed with those conditions are less likely to make it out of the womb. And you can see these statistics from Britain. You can look it up online to see exactly the reasons and the number of children that were aborted for various disabilities, including ones as minor as a cleft palate. Those who are serious about the rights of people with disabilities have to recognise the threat that this poses to the community of people with these conditions. While some have spoken out and asked for images of children with Down syndrome not to be used in this debate, there are many others, parents and siblings of people with disabilities, and people with disabilities themselves, who feel the opposite way. As they see it, allowing babies with disabilities to be aborted would mean that their children would grow up with fewer and fewer others who have the same condition. As isolated as they feel at the moment, this feeling will only increase if these babies are allowed to be killed before birth. In addition, despite the abysmal lack of supports available to families with various disabilities, whatever knowledge and experience medics and others have at the moment would actually decrease over time. A friend of mine who has a daughter with Down syndrome testified to this fact, that when she was living in Britain, her daughter was something of a curiosity to medics there, who simply didn't have the experience of dealing with the medical issues that arise for people with Down syndrome. Her perception was that Irish medics had a totally different approach and were much more experienced. And then finally, we've looked at some of the cultural consequences that would flow from repealing the Eighth. One area of particular concern is the effect on the practice of medicine in this country. In an effort to soothe voters' concerns about the legalisation of abortion and make it sound more palatable, the Taoiseach described what he called a doctor-led, safe and legal system for the termination of pregnancies. Leaving to one side the issue of how safe an abortion is for the baby in question, he stated, there will be restrictions. He went on to describe how doctors will discuss the matter with their patients, but as he said, ultimately though, it will be the woman's decision. And in the case of the late-term abortions proposed by the Taoiseach on the grounds of a risk to the health of the woman or where the child has a terminal illness, again, ultimately, it will be a decision based on the wishes of the woman. The rights of the baby, having been excised from the Constitution, will no longer be a matter of concern to the state, but rather a personal and private matter for the woman. Babies will essentially become property of women and will be treated accordingly, to be kept or disposed of as any individual woman sees fit. This is the Taoiseach's version of balancing of rights. This is progress. This is modern Ireland. Of course, if you legalise abortion, you need people who are willing to carry out abortions. Simon Harris has volunteered the country's GPs and obstetricians, seemingly without consulting them first. A representative of the GPs voiced concerns yesterday morning on radio and in the print media about the fact that GPs were being expected to provide this service without prior consultation. The issue of conscientious objection specifically was also raised. What's being proposed by the government, although presented as healthcare, is not medicine. The first principle of which is do no harm. If this proposal is foisted upon the profession, there will be a significant number of doctors who will object to being the ones who have to get their hands dirty. We've already seen much of the intemperate nature of the campaigning on the pro-repeal side. Many of those calling for the introduction of abortion cannot seem to understand how any person can oppose what they're asking for. And they characterize those who do as bigots or misogynists. It's not at all difficult to imagine that if they get their way and have the law changed so that abortion becomes permissible, they will regard it, as Professor Whyte was indicating, as a culpable denial of a woman's right to health care for any doctor to refuse to participate. Doctors should therefore be very, very worried about what they may be forced to do. Remember, the charge is being led by a party that effectively excommunicated its own members back in 2013 for attempting to assert a right of conscientious objection. So even if this government caves and offers some form of an opt-out as a sop to get the referendum over the line, there is without a constitutionally protected right to conscientious objection, there's nothing to stop a future Oireachtas from revoking any such concession. The practical consequence of this will be that the only people willing to go into the field of obstetrics and even general practice, not to mention nursing and midwifery, will be those who are willing to participate in the deliberate destruction of human life. Medicine in this country will abandon its age-old maxim. Is that what doctors want? Is that what the women of Ireland want? To have someone help deliver your baby who's willing to take the life of somebody else's baby. Finally, I want to end by acknowledging that I am addressing a room of friars and the order of preachers. I have to say I was especially happy to be invited to address you all today. I have really admired the number of new vocations your community has attracted over the last number of years. And in today's world, the decision that you men have made to give your lives to God and His service is countercultural, to say the least, and for that reason, especially brave. By your example, you give great hope to the faithful. I want to encourage you to preach about this issue. While the politicians have tried to make it a political issue, it's not political. This is a human issue that touches us all. It touches the very foundations of the human family and the most fundamental of relationships, that of mother and child. Our very first human experiences are in our mother's womb. When this most intimate of relationships is torn asunder, our society becomes undone. So, though I know that you are and will continue to be fearless in your preaching, please encourage other priests to do the same. Many are fearful to speak about this from their own pulpits, but by failing to do so, they're doing the faithful a great disservice. Priests are anointed not just to lead their flocks, but to educate them too. And the issue of abortion relates to a fundamental precept of our faith, that life is a gift from God, and no one has the right to take that gift from anyone else. The commandment couldn't be more straightforward. Thou shalt not kill. And although this is not just a Christian belief, but rather something that people of all faiths and none should be able to agree on, all Christian people should know it and understand it. That's why it's so important for priests to preach on the subject. I know that the atmosphere, even within Catholic churches, can be hostile, and that by speaking out, priests may face social opprobrium. Although mild by the standard of many saints and martyrs, this persecution is nonetheless real. However, being hated by the world is often the price we pay for speaking the truth and standing up for the marginalised and vulnerable. You have a duty to discharge, as do your brother priests, and I urge you to support one another in doing so. Ireland's constitutional recognition of the right to life of the child before birth is a beacon of light in a world that is growing darker. So let's protect that light and fight. Thank you.